Humphrey is making headway, but he really needs to separate himself from Johnson on the war. So he decided to do this in Salt Lake City with a major speech on Vietnam. That same day, we were arriving at the Cadillac Hotel in Detroit. Nixon was going to address the American Legion the next morning. When we arrived in the hotel suite, Pat Buchanan, who was always staying up on the news, informed Mr. Nixon that Humphrey had made this speech and had separated himself from Johnson. Nixon looked over at me and he said, "Get the president on the phone." Well, I had never called the president of the United States. I didn't even know what to do. So I went down the hallway and found Rosemary Woods. And I said, "Rose, you know, the president wants to talk to, or Mr. Nixon wants to talk to President Johnson. What do I do?" She said, "Well, just call the White House operators, 202-244, whatever it was, and tell them that you have Mr. Nixon calling." So I went back in, dialed the White House, and the White House operators came on. I said, "I have former Vice President Nixon here who would like to speak to President Johnson." And she said, "Thank you." And there was this pause. And then she came back on and she said, "I need to speak with the former Vice President to identify him." So I said, "Sir," I said, "the operators would like to chat with you to identify you." The next thing I hear is this: "Millie, how are you? How's Kate?" You know, and of course, Nixon knew all the White House operators. They didn't turn over when somebody left. And so he obviously made the identification and he used their first names. There was this pause, and then I hear, "Hello, Mr. President, Dick Nixon." "Yes," he says. "Yes." He says, "Well," he says, "I want you to know I just heard what Hubert did out in Salt Lake, and I want you to know that I'm still with you." And then they chatted a few more minutes, and they hung up the phone. So the next morning, Nixon goes and he addresses the American Legion. After he addresses them, we're headed back out to the airport. We're about halfway out to the airport, and Bill Duncan, the lead Secret Service agent, kind of turns and he said, "Mr. Nixon, that's the president's motorcade going into town," because Johnson was on his way into town to address the American Legion himself. About that time, the phone rings, and it is President Johnson calling Mr. Nixon. So Duncan says, "I have President Johnson on the phone here for you." And Nixon gets on this phone. And he said, yes, Mr. President." He said, "Well, I've warmed them up for you." "Right." And then he chuckles and he says, "Yeah." He says, "No, I don't think they want to hear from Hubert." And that was that. And we went on out to the airport.